This is the arch of the aorta. On the right, it gives off what we call the brachiocephalic artery. That is on the right. It gives off the brachiocephalic artery. Then the brachiocephalic artery divides into the right common carotid artery and the right subclavian artery. However, on the left common carotid artery and the left subclavian arteries are direct branches of the arch of the aorta. That is the difference. I repeat, the right common carotid artery and the right subclavian artery are branches of the brachiocephalic artery. Which is a direct branch of the arch of the aorta. However, on the left, the common carotid and the subclavian, for them they come directly from the arch of the aorta. Now, when you look at the two common carotids, the right common carotid and the left common carotid, they ascend to the neck. They ascend to the neck. And when they reach the carotid triangle, they divide. The common carotid arteries divide into the external carotid artery and the internal carotid artery. External carotid artery and internal carotid artery. Then the two internal carotid arteries are going to pass through the carotid canal. The carotid canal is within the skull bone. That's why I told you to come and look at the skull. They are going to pass through the carotid canal and they enter the cranial cavity, where they are going to begin giving off branches to the brain. On the other hand, the two subclavian arteries are going to give off a branch known as the vertebral artery. The vertebral artery. So the two vertebral arteries, these two vertebral arteries, are going to pass through the transverse foramen of the cervical vertebrae. They pass through the transverse foramen of the cervical vertebrae until they reach the foramen magnum, through which they will enter the cranial cavity. So for the two vertebral arteries, they enter the cranial cavity through the foramen magnum. And then they will begin giving off branches which are going to supply the brain and the spinal cord. So we have looked at two blood vessels which enter the cranial cavity to give their supply to the brain. The internal carotid, which passes through the carotid canal, and the two vertebral arteries, which pass through the foramen magnum, and then they will access the cranial cavity. This is the coronal section of the brain, and you're going to see that inferior to the brain. These blood vessels, when they enter the cranial cavity, they first reach the inferior surface of the brain. So if you want to see these blood vessels and the branches they give off, you go to the inferior surface of the brain, where you're going to see the two internal carotids and the two vertebral arteries and the branches they give off. So we have seen how this blood moves from the arch of the aorta and enters the cranial cavity through the internal carotid arteries and then the vertebral arteries. Now we are going to turn the brain upside down to look at the inferior surface of the brain to see when these blood vessels enter the cranial cavity and go to the inferior surface of the brain, how do they branch? This is the same illustration showing us the two vertebral arteries and the two internal carotid arteries. And then when they reach the inferior surface of the brain, they form an anastomosis. When they reach the inferior surface of the brain, they form an anastomosis, which is known as the circle of Willis. So this is the inferior surface of the brain. This is the inferior surface of the brain. We are seeing the two vertebral arteries which entered through the foramen magnum, and then we are seeing the two internal carotid arteries which entered through the carotid canal. And then we only want to see their branches and their anastomosis. We go to the inferior surface of the brain and study them extensively. So, what branches do they give off? We saw these two internal carotid arteries. Now we are looking at the inferior surface of the brain. We are here because this is the brainstem, midbrain, pons, and medulla. So we are on the inferior surface of the brain. We are there. You can see our midbrain, our pons, and our medulla oblongata. This is the junction between the pons and the medulla oblongata, and around there we'll have the junction between the pons and then the midbrain. So this is the same thing you're having. You're having the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. So in other words, we have removed this portion which can be visualized on the inferior surface of the brain and brought it here. Now, these are the two vertebral arteries which enter the cranial cavity through the foramen magnum. And they are moving on the lateral aspect of the medulla oblongata. This is the medulla oblongata. You can see the cranial nerves which are coming out from it. Now, these two vertebral arteries are going to give off the posterior inferior cerebral artery. The name suggests where the artery supplies. The common word is the inferior cerebellum. Inferior cerebellum. It means that it supplies the inferior surface of the cerebellum. That is why they call it inferior cerebellum. It supplies the inferior surface of the cerebellum. But the inferior surface of the cerebellum is divided into the posterior portion and an anterior portion. So when they call it posterior inferior cerebellar artery, it means that it supplies the posterior part of the inferior surface of the cerebellum. So these two vertebral arteries, when they are still moving along the medulla oblongata, they give off the posterior inferior cerebellar arteries. These posterior inferior cerebellar arteries are going to supply the posterior part of the inferior surface of the cerebellum, and they are also going to give off branches to the spinal cord, which is known as the dorsal spinal arteries. Now I want to make a point here. Sometimes these dorsal spinal arteries are direct branches of the vertebra, sometimes. And sometimes they are branches from the posterior inferior cerebellum. So in this case, we are seeing the posterior inferior cerebellum, which is going to supply the posterior part of the inferior surface of the cerebellum, also giving off the dorsal spinal. Dorsal means posterior, spinal means spinal cord, so it's going to supply the posterior aspect of the spinal cord and the medulla oblongata. The vertebral arteries will continue to ascend, and as they are ascending, they give off two branches anteriorly. These two branches meet at this median sulcus, which separates the two medullary pyramids. These are medullary pyramids. So these two branches come and then they will meet at the median fissure. And then when they meet, they are going to form what you call the ventral. You can replace the word ventral with the anterior. Ventral spinal artery. The ventral spinal artery is going to supply the anterior aspect of the medulla oblongata and spinal cord, and the posterior part of the medulla oblongata and the spinal cord will be supplied by these dorsal or posterior spinal arteries. So we have seen our vertebral arteries giving off the posterior inferior cerebellar, the anterior spinal arteries. When the vertebral arteries reach the pontomedullary junction, the junction between the pons and the medulla, they join. When they join, they form what you call the basilar artery. And this basilar artery moves along the anterior surface of the pons. That is why when we are looking at the brain stem, we saw that the anterior surface of the pons has what we call a basilar groove. The groove where the basilar artery moves. It's because when the two vertebral arteries reach the pontomedullary junction, the junction between the pons and the medulla, they join to form the basilar artery, which moves along the anterior surface of the pons. What are the branches of the basilar artery? The first branch is the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. Remember here we had the posterior inferior cerebellar. Both these arteries supplies the inferior surface of the cerebellum. This one supplies the anterior portion of the inferior surface of the cerebellum, and this one supplies the posterior portion of the inferior surface of the cerebellum. So this is the counterpart, the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. It's the first branch. Then the basilar artery gives off what you call the labyrinthine artery. Whenever they talk about the labyrinth, they're talking about the inner ear. And if this artery is blocked, the inner ear will begin degenerating, the tissue of the inner ear, and you lose balance. So this is the artery which is going to the inner ear, known as the labyrinthine artery. So it's a branch of the basilar. Then we are going to have branches to the pons. Some of the all these branches which are supplying the pons are known as pontine arteries. Some of them are long because they go and also supply the posterior surface of the pons. That's why they call them circumferential pontine arteries, because they are long and they can reach the posterior surface of the pons. That's why we call them the circumferential pontine arteries. Others are short. They call them paramedian pontine arteries because they only end at the anterior surface of the pons. But all of them are pontine arteries. The circumferential and the paramedian, all of them are pontine arteries, and they are supplying the pons. Then the basilar artery gives off another branch known as the superior cerebellar artery. This is simple. The name suggests where it supplies. The superior cerebellar artery supplies the superior surface of the cerebellum. That's why they call it the superior cerebellar artery. And in our specimens, we have some of these blood vessels. When we come, we shall look at them. After giving off the superior cerebellar artery, the pontine or the basilar artery will finally bifurcate. It will finally bifurcate in the region of the midbrain, and its final bifurcation, it gives off these posterior cerebral arteries. So the basilar artery finally terminates by bifurcating into the posterior cerebral arteries. When you look at the name posterior cerebral, which lobe of the cerebrum do these blood vessels supply? I need someone to answer. When they say that this is the posterior cerebral artery, which lobe of the cerebrum do these blood vessels supply?
Occipital lobe.
They supply the occipital lobe. They supply the occipital lobe of the cerebrum. But they also give off branches to the mid-brain, which we shall see, and also what we call a posterior choroidal artery, which will also go to supply regions around the eye, but mainly supplying the posterior aspect of the cerebrum. That's why they call them posterior cerebral artery, where you find the occipital lobe. That is how blood which came into the vertebral arteries terminates. What about the branch which came in through the internal carotid arteries? The internal carotid arteries, when they reach the cranial cavity, they are going to give off a small branch known as the ophthalmic artery, which is going to go to the orbits to supply structures of the orbit, the ophthalmic artery. Then the internal carotids are going to give off what we call the middle cerebral artery. Then they will give off what we call the anterior cerebral artery. And then they will give off what we call the posterior communicating artery. The branches of the internal carotids are ophthalmic artery, middle cerebral artery, anterior cerebral artery, and posterior communicating artery. The posterior communicating artery is a very important anastomosis because it connects the internal carotid with the posterior cerebral artery in such a way that if the basilar artery or the vertebral arteries are blocked, blood may not reach these other parts, but it will come in through the internal carotid, posterior communicating, and compensate. And that is why this posterior communicating artery is a very important anastomosis. Now, the middle cerebral artery is going to go to the lateral aspect of the cerebral hemisphere. It is going to go to the lateral aspect of the cerebral hemisphere to supply the lateral aspect of the cerebral hemisphere. Around there, you have part of the frontal lobe, part of the parietal lobe, part of the temporal lobe. So it is the middle cerebral is going to go and supply the lateral aspect of the cerebral hemisphere. The anterior cerebral artery is going to go and supply the medial aspect of the hemisphere. When we made the sagittal section, we saw the medial aspect of the hemisphere. So this is going to supply the anterior portion of the medial aspect of the cerebral hemisphere minus the occipital lobe. And we are going to see images showing us those regions supplied by these blood vessels. The two anterior cerebral arteries are joined together by an important anastomosis known as the anterior communicating artery. If this internal carotid artery is blocked, blood can come in through this side, anterior communicating, and then compensate on this side. Hence, the circle of Willis is this. And it is in the region of the midbrain because this is our pons, this is our medulla oblongata, this is our pons, and this is the midbrain. And then we are seeing our circle of Willis here. Which blood vessels form the circle of Willis? We have the posterior communicating artery, the anterior cerebral artery, the anterior communicating artery. Then we come back to the anterior cerebral artery, posterior communicating artery, and then the two posterior cerebral arteries. And these ones are the ones which form that important anastomosis known as the circle of Willis. This is the circle of Willis. So here we are looking at the medial aspect of the hemisphere in sagittal section. The medial aspect of the cerebral hemisphere in sagittal section. And we are going to look at the anterior cerebral arteries. So the anterior cerebral arteries are these ones. They come and curve above the corpus callosum. They supply this medial aspect of the cerebral hemisphere up to the parietal occipital sulcus. So the anterior cerebral artery supplies the medial aspect of the frontal lobe and the medial aspect of the parietal lobe. And it ends at the parietal occipital sulcus. Then the medial aspect of the occipital lobe and the medial aspect of the temporal lobe are supplied by the posterior cerebral arteries. So this is the posterior cerebral artery. We saw it here, the posterior cerebral artery, this one. It is going to go and supplies the medial aspect of the temporal lobe and the medial aspect of the occipital lobe. And the anterior cerebral artery, this one, is the one which is going to supply the medial aspect of the frontal lobe and the medial aspect of the parietal lobe. It gives off those branches as it is curving above the corpus callosum. So this is how the medial aspect of the cerebral hemisphere is supplied with blood. What about the lateral aspect? Now, this anterior cerebral artery, is going to send branches to supply a narrow strip on the lateral aspect of the hemisphere. Let us see. Now, these are the branches. These branches you see there are going to go and supply a narrow strip on the lateral aspect of the hemisphere. And these are the ones. So these are the spillover branches of the anterior cerebral artery. After it has supplies the medial aspect of the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, it sends spillover branches which are going to supply a narrow strip on the superior aspect of the lateral aspect of the hemisphere. These are the branches of the anterior cerebral arteries which are spilling over. Still on the lateral aspect, the occipital lobe will still be under the supply of the posterior cerebral artery. When you look at this posterior cerebral artery, it also sends spillover branches to the lateral aspect of the hemisphere, which we are seeing here, supplying the occipital lobe. In other words, the entire occipital lobe, both on the medial and on the lateral, is supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. Now, the posterior cerebral artery supplies the medial aspect of the temporal lobe. It supplies the medial aspect of the temporal lobe and also sends spillover branches, which we are seeing here, which supplies the inferior gyrus of the temporal lobe. So the posterior cerebral artery supplies the entire of the medial surface of the temporal lobe, and then it goes on the lateral aspect, sends branches on the lateral aspect of the hemisphere to supply the inferior gyrus of the temporal lobe. The rest of the lateral aspect, which is not supplied by the spillover branches of the anterior cerebral artery and the spillover branches of the posterior cerebral artery, the rest of the lateral aspect of the hemisphere, which is not supplied by these two, is the one which is supplied by the middle cerebral artery. And the middle cerebral artery, we saw it is this one. So the rest of the lateral aspect of the hemisphere, cerebral hemisphere, is the one which is supplied by the middle cerebral artery. So we can know the areas here. We have the prefrontal cortex. You can see supplied by these spillover branches of the anterior cerebral artery. We have the motor areas here supplied by the middle cerebral artery. We have these auditory areas supplied by the middle cerebral artery. We have the visual areas supplied by the posterior cerebral arteries. So we have seen how the three cerebral arteries, the anterior cerebral artery, the posterior cerebral artery, and the middle cerebral artery, they call them cerebral arteries because they're supplying the cerebrum, and we have seen how they supply the medial and lateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere. This is another illustration of what I have been